Pay attention to this photograph. Not the crowd, not the stadium, not the game. Look at the man in the navy blazer, center frame. His head is turned completely away from the camera at an angle that shouldn't be physically comfortable, like he knew exactly where the lens was pointing and made a deliberate choice to stay invisible. Everyone else in this bleacher section is facing the field, watching the game, doing exactly what you'd expect a person at a stadium to do, but not him. Now look at the woman directly behind him. Brown hair, blue eyes, gold drop earrings. She's not watching the game either. She's watching him. That expression on her face, and I want you to really look at it, is not the expression of a stranger standing behind a stranger in a crowd. This photograph was taken on an ordinary afternoon at an ordinary charity game. The man in the navy blazer had been reported missing 5 days before this photo was taken, and his wife had already buried him. You know that feeling when a photo captures something that shouldn't be there? When you're scrolling through pictures from a normal day and something in the back of your mind goes cold before you've even consciously registered what you're looking at? For amateur photographer Dale Whitmore, that feeling arrived 3 weeks after he'd already forgotten about the shot entirely. He'd been at Harwick Stadium for the city's annual charity invitational on a September afternoon. Just a guy with a decent camera doing what people do at public events, pointing it at the crowd, the energy, the general atmosphere. He took maybe 300 photographs that day. He uploaded some, deleted others, moved on with his life. 3 weeks later, a colleague borrowed his camera card to pull some event photos and mentioned almost in passing that there was an odd one in there. A man in the crowd with his face completely turned away, and a woman behind him who looked like she was staring at the back of his head the way you'd stare at someone you'd been following for months. Dale looked at the image and felt the cold thing hit him too, not because of any specific detail he could immediately name, just the wrongness of it, the intentionality. Every other person in that frame was doing something natural. This man was performing the act of not being seen. Dale mentioned it to a friend who happened to work in the county prosecutor's office. The friend made a call. The call reached a detective named Marcus Holt, and Marcus Holt, within 48 hours of seeing the photograph for the first time, was sitting across a table from a woman named Petra Voss, watching the color drain out of her face as she looked at the image and said very quietly, "That's his jacket. That's his exact jacket. But Raymond is dead. I buried him." That was the moment a Tuesday afternoon became one of the most disorienting missing persons investigations the department had handled in years. A case built on a photograph, a buried mannequin, 17 pings between 2 burner phones, and a woman in Portugal who smiled pleasantly through every interview and never once slipped. Raymond Voss, insurance adjuster, husband, missing person, or maybe not missing at all. That's the thing about this case. Nobody could ever quite agree on what Raymond was, or where he went, or whether, somewhere out there, he was choosing not to be found. That particular uncertainty is what makes the Bleacher Phantom case different from almost any other disappearance case you'll encounter. Most missing persons cases are tragedies of absence. This one is something stranger. A case where the missing person appears to have left a forwarding address written in cedar and lavender and 17 silent pings, pointing somewhere nobody managed to follow. Raymond Voss was 44 years old when he disappeared, and by every available account, he was the kind of man who was easy to underestimate. He worked as a mid-level adjuster for a regional insurance firm called Paxton and Hollis, based out of Stonebridge, Connecticut. He'd been with the company for 11 years. His performance reviews were described by his manager as consistently adequate. Not brilliant, not problematic, adequate. He drove a gray sedan he'd owned for 6 years and hadn't bothered to wash recently. He had a standing Tuesday night bowling league with 3 colleagues he didn't particularly socialize with outside of bowling. He was, in most measurable ways, a person who occupied space in the world without announcing himself. His wife Petra described their marriage in those early interviews as comfortable, not her first choice of words. The detective interviewing her, a Stonebridge PD officer named Carla Denton, noted in her report that Petra had paused for several seconds before settling on that word, as if she'd cycled through several alternatives and decided comfortable was the least revealing option that was still technically true. They had been married for 12 years, no children, a house in the east side of Stonebridge that they'd bought in 2001, and that had a mortgage they were still paying down. Raymond had a sister in Portland who they saw at Christmas if it was convenient and less often if it wasn't. Petra had a mother in a care facility in Bridgeport and a sister in Phoenix she talked to regularly on the phone. It was a life, not a particularly dramatic one, which made what happened next so thoroughly strange. Raymond Voss was reported missing on September 9, 2011. Petra told Officer Denton that she'd come home from work on the evening of September 9th to find the house empty. Raymond's gray sedan was still in the driveway. His wallet was on the kitchen counter. His phone was on the bedside table. The back door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. His bowling bag was missing, but bowling was on Tuesdays and September 9th was a Friday, so that was strange. Otherwise, Petra said, the house looked normal. She'd cooked dinner, eaten alone, assumed he'd gone for a walk or visited a neighbor and gone to bed. He hadn't been there when she woke up. The missing persons report was filed on the morning of September 10th. Standard process. Raymond had no history of depression or mental illness that Petra knew of. No financial pressures beyond the normal ones, no recent arguments that she described as serious, no reason, as far as she could explain it, for a man to walk out of his own life on a Friday evening without his wallet or his phone. The Stonebridge PD launched a standard missing persons investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood. They checked with Raymond's colleagues at Paxton and Hollis, who confirmed he hadn't shown up for work on September 10th. They pulled his bank records and found no activity after September 8th. No withdrawals, no card transactions, nothing. His credit cards were untouched. If Raymond had run away, he'd done it without money. Then on September 19th, Petra Voss called the Stonebridge PD and told them that Raymond was dead. She said she'd received a phone call from an unknown number the previous evening, a man's voice she didn't recognize telling her that Raymond had died by suicide in a motel room in Norwalk and that she needed to come and make a formal identification. She said the voice had given her an address and told her to come alone. She had gone, she said, because she didn't know what else to do. Detective Marcus Holt was assigned to take her statement. He asked her to walk him through exactly what had happened at that address. Petra described arriving at a motel on Route 7, being met at the door by a man in medical-style scrubs who told her Raymond had been found unresponsive in room 14 and had died before an ambulance could be summoned. She said she was taken into a room where a body was laid out on the bed, covered to the chin with a sheet. She said the face was consistent with Raymond's, that she was distressed and didn't look closely, that she confirmed it was him and signed a form the man in scrubs handed her. Holt asked her what was on the form. She said it was a release form for the body to be handled by a private funeral service. She said she'd signed it without reading it carefully because she was in shock. She said the private funeral service had handled everything within 48 hours. Cremation was offered, she'd agreed, and the ashes she received 3 days later were now in a small urn on the mantelpiece of the house on the east side of Stonebridge. Raymond Voss, as far as Petra was concerned, and as far as any official record showed, was dead. Holt was troubled by almost everything about this account. There was no registered death in Norwalk for anyone matching Raymond's description during the relevant period. There was no record of any ambulance call or medical examiner visit to the motel on Route 7. The motel itself confirmed no guest named Raymond Voss or matching Raymond's description had been registered to room 14 on the relevant dates. The private funeral service Petra named, a company called Serene Passage, had a registered business address in New Haven that turned out to be a mailbox in a postal facility. The form Petra had signed no longer existed. She'd given it to the man in scrubs and hadn't kept a copy. Holt filed an expanded case report on September 22nd. He noted that either Raymond Voss was deceased under circumstances that had been deliberately falsified and concealed, or Raymond Voss was alive, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make his wife believe he was dead. He could not, at that stage, determine which of these was true. Then, on October 3, 2011, Dale Whitmore's colleague mentioned the photograph. Dale Whitmore was a graphic designer who attended the Harwick Stadium Charity Invitational every year because his company sponsored one of the charitable causes the event supported. He went, took photos for the company's social media, and left. He was not a particularly forensically minded person. He was not looking for anything in the crowd photographs he took. He just had a good eye and a decent camera, and a habit of capturing the atmosphere rather than the action. The photograph in question had been taken at approximately 2:47 p.m. on September 14, 2011, based on the timestamp embedded in the image file. It showed a crowded bleacher section from a low angle, the kind of shot you get when you're holding the camera at chest height and letting the crowd fill the frame. The man in the navy blazer dominated the center of the image. His back was to the camera, head turned to the side in a way that seemed almost physically exaggerated, like someone who had peripherally sensed a lens and made a swift, practiced adjustment. Around him, 100 people in stadium noise watched a game. Behind him, a woman watched him. When Holt sat across from Petra Voss with a printout of that photograph, he watched her face carefully. She went through several visible stages: confusion, recognition, something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite relief, but was a combination of all three that she seemed unable to process fast enough to choose one. She said the words about the jacket. "That's his jacket. That's his exact jacket. But Raymond is dead. I buried him." Holt asked her to explain. She clarified she hadn't buried Raymond. The ashes she'd received were in an urn. She had buried the urn in Millhaven Cemetery on September 27th in a small private ceremony attended only by herself, Raymond's sister from Portland, and Petra's sister calling in from Phoenix on speakerphone. She had bought a headstone. She had paid for the plot. She had done everything you do when someone dies, for a man who was apparently 5 days before his ashes were delivered to her door, walking around at a charity sporting event in his navy blazer with his face turned away from cameras. Holt ordered the exhumation of the burial plot at Millhaven Cemetery. That order was executed on October 6, 2011, 27 days after the charity game photograph had been taken. What they found in the ground at Millhaven was not Raymond Voss. It was not ashes in an urn, which is what should have been there. What they found, buried at a standard grave depth in a sealed casket that had been placed in that plot after Petra's ceremony, was a mannequin. A department store mannequin, the torso and head variety, dressed in a blue hospital gown. The cavity of the mannequin's hollow torso had been filled with cedarwood chips and small cloth sachets containing dried lavender. The cedar and lavender produced a faint, pleasant smell that the forensic team noted in their report as incongruous. Whoever had placed this thing in the ground had taken the time to make it smell nice. The urn that Petra had received and believed contained Raymond's ashes was tested. The contents were consistent with wood ash, specifically cedar wood, not human remains. Someone had given Petra a container of wood ash from the same cedar chips that filled the mannequin in the grave. The investigation was formally reclassified from missing persons to suspected staged death on October 7th, 2011. The case was assigned to Detective Holt at the state level, with Stonebridge PD cooperating, and the photograph, which had started all of this, became the central piece of evidence around which everything else would need to be constructed. The woman behind Raymond in the photograph. Brown hair, blue eyes, gold drop earrings. Not watching the game, watching him. It took 8 days to identify her. Her name was Nola Crane. She was 38 years old. She had been a forensic accountant in a firm that did compliance work for regional financial institutions. She was educated, meticulous, and, according to the civil court records Holt pulled within hours of identifying her, deeply connected to Raymond Voss through a legal proceeding that had concluded 7 years earlier and had not, apparently, concluded cleanly. In 2004, Raymond Voss had been the subject of a civil fraud case brought by a regional credit union that claimed he had systematically misrepresented the value of several commercial property insurance claims over a 3-year period, inflating payouts and directing portions of the excess to a shell company he controlled through a third party. It was a complicated case involving actuarial tables, property assessments, and financial records that required expert testimony to translate for a jury. That expert testimony had been provided by a forensic accountant named Nola Crane. Nola's testimony had been detailed, clear, and devastating. She had sat in that courtroom for 3 days and methodically dismantled every defense Raymond's attorneys had constructed. The civil judgment had gone against Raymond. He had paid back the fraudulent gains plus damages, a sum that was significant but not catastrophic, and had retained his position at Paxton and Hollis partly because the fraud had been conducted through personal channels rather than company ones, and partly because the company found replacing him more trouble than it was worth. He had gone back to his gray sedan and his Tuesday bowling league and his adequately reviewed performance metrics, and he had, as far as anyone could tell, accepted the judgment and moved on. But here was the thing. The fraud case had concluded in 2004. Nola Crane had testified in 2004, and between 2004 and 2011, according to what Holt was now pulling from various databases and records, Nola Crane's life had taken a series of turns that were genuinely difficult to explain. In 2005, a year after the Raymond Voss civil judgment, Nola had left her forensic accounting firm under circumstances described in HR records as voluntary resignation following a period of personal difficulty. In 2006, she had been briefly hospitalized following what her medical records, which Holt obtained through proper channels, described as an acute stress episode. In early 2007, she had applied for and received a Portuguese residency visa. By mid-2007, records suggested she was living in Lisbon. She had a Portuguese mobile number. She had made purchases in Lisbon. She had a Lisbon address. She had, by every official measure, relocated to Portugal following a nervous breakdown and rebuilt her life there. And yet here she was, standing behind Raymond Voss in a bleacher section of Harwick Stadium in Connecticut on September 14, 2011, watching him with an expression that a detective might charitably describe as focused and less charitably describe as predatory. Holt needed to talk to Nola Crane. Getting to Nola Crane took longer than it should have, for reasons that became, in retrospect, one of the more troubling aspects of the entire case. The initial contact was made through Interpol coordination with Portuguese authorities. A request was submitted on October 15, 2011, asking for a welfare check and request for interview at the Lisbon address on file for Nola Crane. The Portuguese authorities visited the address on October 18th and reported that Nola was present, cooperative, and stated she had been in Lisbon for the duration of September 2011, had not traveled to the United States, and was available for a formal interview if required. The formal interview was conducted via video link on October 22, 2011, with Detective Holt asking questions and a Portuguese investigator present to ensure procedural compliance. Nola Crane was calm throughout. She was articulate. She was pleasant in the careful, measured way of someone who has thought through every possible question in advance and prepared answers that are technically accurate without being fully truthful. She acknowledged knowing Raymond Voss from the 2004 civil fraud case. She said she had no contact with him since her testimony. She said she had moved to Portugal for health reasons following a difficult period in her life and had been content there. She said she had not attended the Harwick Stadium Charity Invitational on September 14, 2011, had not been in Connecticut at any point during September 2011, and had no knowledge of Raymond Voss's disappearance. Then Holt showed her the photograph. She looked at it for a long moment. She said the woman behind the man in the navy blazer did bear a resemblance to her. She could see why someone might think so, but it was not her. She said there were many women with brown hair and blue eyes and gold drop earrings. She said she was sorry she couldn't be more helpful. Before Holt could press further on specific details in the image, Nola's legal representative, a Portuguese attorney who had been present throughout but had not previously spoken, intervened to note that the interview had reached its agreed time limit. The session ended. Holt was certain she was lying. He had no way to prove it yet. The passport was the next problem. When Holt formally requested Nola's passport records through Interpol, the Portuguese authorities confirmed that Nola Crane's passport showed an entry stamp for Portugal dated September 12, 2011, and an exit stamp from the United Kingdom dated September 10, 2011. The dates were airtight. She had, according to her passport, been traveling from the UK to Portugal in the days leading up to September 14th, and the entry stamp confirmed she was in Lisbon on the 12th, 2 days before the photograph was taken. You cannot be in Connecticut and Lisbon at the same time. Holt stared at those passport records for a long time. He pulled everything he could find on the movement of the passport between September 10th and September 15th. The stamps were real. The travel was documented. The Portuguese immigration records matched the passport entries. Everything that could be verified checked out. And yet the photograph existed. The woman in the photograph looked like Nola Crane. The woman in the photograph was not watching the game. She was watching Raymond Voss in a way that suggested intimate familiarity with where he was going to be standing and when. Two possibilities had to coexist until one could be eliminated. Either the woman in the photograph was not Nola Crane, in which case Nola Crane was an unfortunate look-alike, and the real mystery was who the actual woman was. Or the woman in the photograph was Nola Crane, in which case either her passport had been fraudulently stamped or there was a second passport that nobody had yet found. While Holt worked the Nola Crane angle, Petra Voss was living through something that the official investigation reports described clinically, but which was, in human terms, one of the more surreal situations imaginable. She had buried her husband. She had received his ashes. She had grieved and transitioned and begun, slowly and painfully, to reconstruct a life without him. And then a photograph had arrived that suggested he had been walking around in his navy blazer 5 days after he disappeared, being watched by a woman who had testified against him in a fraud case 7 years earlier. And the grave she had visited and brought flowers to contained a cedar-scented mannequin. Her therapist, who she had been seeing since Raymond's disappearance, and who provided a brief statement to investigators confirming Petra's general psychological state without disclosing confidential details, noted in that statement that Petra was processing compounded traumas on multiple timelines simultaneously. The grief of losing Raymond, which had been real regardless of what had actually happened to him. The disorientation of discovering the loss might not have been what she was told it was. The violation of having been deliberately deceived about the nature of the ashes she'd received and the contents of the grave she'd tended. And the fundamental uncertainty of not knowing whether the man she'd been married to for 12 years had chosen, in some sense, to disappear from her specifically. That last one was the hardest. Holt saw it in every interview with Petra. She never asked whether Raymond was dead. She always asked whether Raymond had left. Those were different questions that pointed to different kinds of grief, and Petra's instinct to ask the second one rather than the first suggested she suspected the answer was the one she least wanted to be true. The burner phones entered the picture at this point. The Connecticut State Police had subpoenaed the cell tower records for the geographic area of Harwick Stadium for September 14th, as part of the expanded investigation into Raymond Voss. The records covered a 4-hour window centered on the time the photograph was taken. Standard process for a case involving a disappeared person apparently appearing at a documented public event. When the analysts went through the records, they found what they were looking for and considerably more than they'd expected. Somewhere in the stadium area on the afternoon of September 14th, 2 mobile devices had been active simultaneously that did not correspond to any registered phone number on any carrier's legitimate customer database. They were burner phones, prepaid, purchased with cash. Both had been activated within the past 3 weeks. Here is the thing about those 2 phones that Holt found most disturbing when the analysis was complete. They never made or received a single voice call or text message, not one. What they did, for a period of 94 minutes during which the photograph was taken, was exchange a series of signal pings with each other. 17 pings total, spaced at irregular intervals ranging from 3 minutes to 9 minutes, but averaging roughly 5.5 minutes. They were in close proximity to each other throughout, consistent with two devices held by people standing in the same section of the stadium. The phones weren't communicating in any conventional sense. They weren't calling each other. They were simply registering each other's presence repeatedly over the course of an afternoon, like a heartbeat monitor confirming that two things were still alive and still close together. Both phones had been purchased at a pharmacy 40 miles from Harwick on August 31st, 2011, 14 days before the game. Cash transaction. The pharmacy's security camera had captured the purchase, but the image quality was poor, and the person buying was wearing a hat and kept their head angled away from the lens. The footage was enhanced as much as the technology of the time allowed. It showed a person of medium build, dark hair visible at the edges of the hat, buying two prepaid phones. Nothing that could identify anyone, nothing that could eliminate anyone. Both phones went dark after September 14th. They were never used again. They simply stopped pinging anything from that afternoon onward, as if they had served whatever purpose they'd been purchased for and been discarded. The cedar and lavender were bothering Holt too. This was not the kind of detail you'd expect from a crime that was improvised or panicked. The mannequin in the grave had been selected, dressed, placed carefully. The cedar chips and lavender sachets had been acquired and packed into the mannequin's cavity. The wood ash that had been given to Petra as Raymond's cremated remains had been sourced and prepared. All of this required time, planning, and a particular kind of methodical precision. It required someone who thought several steps ahead and paid attention to details that didn't strictly need to be attended to. Filling a mannequin with cedar and lavender doesn't affect whether the deception works or doesn't. The deception would have functioned just as well with the mannequin empty or filled with packing material. The cedar and lavender were, in some sense, unnecessary. They served no functional purpose. They were a choice made for reasons beyond the operational requirements of the scheme. Holt thought about that a lot, the lavender especially. There was something almost tender about it. The civil fraud case from 2004 was worth revisiting in detail at this point, and Holt spent 2 weeks in November 2011 going back through every document and deposition from that proceeding. He was looking for anything that might explain the connection between Raymond Voss and Nola Crane that was more than just expert witness and civil defendant. The case itself had been a fairly complex piece of financial litigation by the standards of a regional civil court. The credit union that had brought the suit was a mid-sized institution serving several towns in Fairfield County, and the specific claims centered on a series of commercial property insurance assessments Raymond had handled between 2001 and 2003. The allegation was that Raymond had worked in coordination with a property manager named Gino Ferretti, who had since died of a heart attack in 2008 and could not be questioned, to inflate the assessed damage values on 6 commercial property claims. The inflated assessments had generated larger payouts, portions of which had allegedly been redirected to a shell company called Albright Holdings, which had been traced through subpoenaed banking records to a personal account Raymond controlled through a third-party trustee. The total amount in question was significant, a shade over $300,000 across the 6 claims. Raymond's share, per the plaintiff's calculation, had been approximately $140,000. The civil judgment had ordered full repayment plus damages amounting to roughly $260,000 total. For a man at Raymond's income level, that was not a comfortable sum to part with, though not a catastrophic one. Nola Crane's role had been to reconstruct the financial flows from the original insurance assessments through to the Albright Holdings account, demonstrating the connection in enough forensic detail to satisfy the civil standard of proof. She had done this with the methodical precision of someone who genuinely loved the work. Every transaction, every date, every document reference was mapped and cross-referenced. The jury, such as it was in a civil bench proceeding, had found the evidence compelling. What Holt found was not in the official court record. It was in a deposition addendum that had been filed and then withdrawn on a procedural technicality, and which sat in the case archive without being formally part of the proceeding. The addendum contained testimony from a financial investigator who had been retained by Raymond's defense team. The investigator had alleged, in this withdrawn document, that Nola Crane's forensic accounting analysis contained a methodological error that had significantly overstated the value of the fraudulent gains. The defense had attempted to introduce this to challenge Nola's credibility. The withdrawal had occurred because the investigator's own methodology was challenged by the plaintiff's attorneys on procedural grounds before the testimony could be formally entered. But the substance of the allegation was there in the withdrawn document, and if the allegation was even partially accurate, it meant that the damages Raymond had paid based on Nola's testimony had been inflated, which meant Raymond had paid more than the actual harm warranted, which meant Raymond had, potentially, a legitimate grievance against Nola Crane that had never been adjudicated because the evidence supporting it had been kept out of the record on a technicality. Holt found himself reading that withdrawn deposition document 3 times in one sitting. The methodological argument it contained was technical enough that he had to consult with a forensic accounting specialist to fully understand it. The specialist told him that the argument had some merit. Not enough to overturn the civil judgment, probably, but enough to support a challenge. Enough to support the view that Raymond Voss had been asked to pay more than a precisely accurate analysis would have required. $260,000. That was the number Holt kept coming back to. What does $260,000 do to a man who drives a gray sedan he hasn't washed in months and describes his marriage as comfortable and works somewhere he's been rated as consistently adequate for 11 years? What does it do to him to believe, for 7 years, that he paid that amount on the basis of numbers that were wrong? And what does he eventually do about it? Was that a motive? For what, exactly, it was hard to say. For disappearing? For staging his own death? For making contact with Nola Crane 7 years after the civil judgment, at a charity game in a stadium where she was allegedly watching him from 3 feet away? Holt couldn't construct a coherent narrative yet. He had pieces that didn't fit into any shape he recognized. A man who disappeared, a woman who might or might not have been watching him from a bleacher, a grave full of cedar-scented mannequin, 17 heartbeat pings between 2 silent phones, and a passport that said the most obvious suspect had been in another country when the photograph was taken. He interviewed Petra Voss again in late November. He asked her questions he hadn't asked before, about the marriage, the finances, whether Raymond had ever mentioned Nola Crane's name. Petra said she knew about the civil fraud case, knew about Nola's testimony, had seen Raymond's anger about it at the time. She said he had referred to Nola Crane on several occasions in the years following the judgment using language she declined to repeat. She said it had faded over time, or she had assumed it had faded. She also said something else in that November interview that Holt noted carefully and returned to later. She said that in the final year before Raymond disappeared, roughly from late 2010 through 2011, she had noticed changes in him that she hadn't been able to explain at the time. He had become more private, not secretive in an alarming way, more just quietly self-contained. He had started taking longer drives on weekend afternoons, telling her he needed air. He had started coming home from bowling on Tuesday nights later than usual, sometimes by an hour or more, and when she asked about it, he said the bowling ran long or they'd gone for drinks after. She had accepted these explanations because she had no reason not to. She had trusted her husband. She wanted Holt to know that. She had trusted him. Holt heard the weight in that statement, the past tense of it. Holt asked Petra about the bowling bag. Raymond's bowling bag had been missing when he disappeared. Of all the things that were strange about the circumstances of September 9th, the bowling bag struck Holt as the most specific. Everything else Raymond had left behind could be explained by someone leaving in a hurry or under coercion. But you don't take your bowling bag when you're taken by surprise. You take it when you're going somewhere you plan to be. Petra said she hadn't thought about the bowling bag. She thought about it now, visibly, in the silence that followed the question. She said she didn't know what to make of it. Holt didn't either. Not yet. December 2011 brought the first significant development in the investigation since the exhumation. A retired postal worker in Stonebridge, a man named Gerald Sousa, who had delivered mail on Dale Whitmore Street for 22 years before retiring in 2009, contacted the police tip line to report that he had seen something odd at Dale's mailbox on the morning of October 1st. He had been taking his usual morning walk through the old neighborhood when he'd noticed a car parked on the street outside Dale's house around 6 a.m. A dark sedan, not a model he recognized. A person had walked from the car to Dale's mailbox, placed something inside, and walked back to the car without looking around. The car had driven away without haste. Gerald had thought it was unusual, but had assumed it was a courier or someone with a legitimate reason for early morning mail delivery. He hadn't called it in because, he said, it had slipped his mind until he saw the news coverage about the stadium photograph case. October 1st was the day Dale Whitmore had opened his mailbox and found a fully printed copy of the photograph he said he deleted from his camera card, addressed to him. No return address, a sticky note reading, "Nice shot." Gerald Sousa could not describe the person he'd seen. They were bundled up, moving quickly, indistinct. He could say with confidence that the car was dark, possibly navy or charcoal gray. He could not provide a plate number. He had not written anything down at the time because, as he said, a person walking to a mailbox at 6 a.m. on a public street is not inherently suspicious. The photograph hadn't come from nowhere. Someone had printed it, addressed it, and delivered it personally to Dale Whitmore's house before 6 a.m. on October 1st. A person who knew Dale's name. A person who knew his address. A person who had, somehow, access to an image that Dale said he had deleted from his camera on the evening of September 14th. The deleted image recovery was the next thread. Digital forensic specialists were brought in to examine Dale's camera card in January 2012. What they found was consistent with what Dale had described. The image file had been deleted. But deletion on a camera card, as any digital forensic specialist will tell you, doesn't immediately destroy the file. It flags the space as available for overwriting. The actual data persists until something else is written to that space. In Dale's case, several subsequent photographs had partially overwritten the deleted file, but not completely. A partial reconstruction of the file metadata was possible. The metadata told them something significant. The image file had been accessed and copied 3 hours after Dale said he deleted it via a card reader connected to an unknown device. The timestamp was 11:34 p.m. on September 14, 2011. Dale said he'd gone to bed before midnight that evening. He said he had no memory of accessing the image after deleting it. He said no one else had access to his camera equipment. Someone had copied that photograph from Dale Whitmore's camera card or from a device connected to it in the middle of the night on the same day the photograph was taken. Before Dale even knew the image had anything significant in it, before anyone had identified Raymond Voss in the crowd, before the investigation existed, which meant that whoever had sent Dale that printed photograph already knew on the night of September 14th that the photograph mattered. The case broke open not through a dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of 4 separate threads that Holt had been pulling for months, and that, in February 2012, finally converged in a way that let him see the shape of what had actually happened. Thread 1. The passport. A specialist in document fraud at the FBI, a woman named Agent Caroline Vetter, had been brought in to review the Portuguese passport records for Nola Crane. Vetter had spent 15 years looking at passport irregularities and had a particular expertise in entry stamp anomalies. She examined the physical passport, which had been obtained through Interpol, and the corresponding immigration database records from Portuguese customs. What she found, and this required a very specific technical eye to see, was a discrepancy in the entry stamp ink saturation. The September 12th entry stamp into Portugal was printed with a slightly different ink composition than the surrounding stamps from earlier entries. Not dramatically different, not enough to constitute definitive proof of forgery, but different enough, combined with a marginal misalignment in the stamp placement that was consistent with a stamp applied by someone copying a reference rather than an official operating from established muscle memory, to constitute what Vetter described in her report as a significant anomaly warranting further investigation. The further investigation was a comparison of the Portuguese immigration database records against the airline records for the specific flights on which Nola would have traveled if the stamps were genuine. Her name did not appear on any passenger manifest for flights from the UK to Portugal in the relevant date range. There was a flight from London Heathrow to Lisbon on September 11th that she could have taken based on the stamp dates. Her name was not on the passenger list. Neither was any variation of her name or any name that could be connected to her known aliases or identity documents. The September 12th Portugal entry stamp was fraudulent. Nola Crane had not been in Portugal on September 12, 2011, which meant she had not been in Portugal on September 14th, which meant the woman behind Raymond Voss in the bleacher section of Harwick Stadium was exactly who Holt had believed she was from the beginning. Thread 2. The pharmacy footage. The security camera footage from the pharmacy where the burner phones had been purchased was re-examined in January 2012 using image enhancement software that had been updated since the original analysis. The new analysis produced a cleaner image of the person at the register. Still not definitive facial identification, still a hat angled to avoid the lens, but the enhanced footage showed something the original hadn't clearly revealed. The person's right hand, visible briefly during the transaction, wore a distinctive ring, a large oval stone, dark-colored, set in a silver band on the middle finger. In the stadium photograph, the woman behind Raymond Voss, the woman Holt believed was Nola Crane, had her right hand partially visible at the lower edge of the frame. The ring was visible. An oval stone, dark-colored, silver band, middle finger of the right hand. It was not proof. Rings can look similar, but it was one more data point on the same side of the ledger. Thread 3. The bowling bag. In February 2012, a storage facility in Fairfield County, 40 minutes from Stonebridge, was contacted by a new tenant who had rented a unit in October 2011 and was now requesting to vacate it. The unit had been rented in October under a name that, when the facility manager ran it through a rental history search before releasing the deposit, triggered a flag. The name on the rental agreement was an alias that had appeared in the financial investigation records from the 2004 Voss civil fraud case as one of the shell company names Raymond had allegedly used. Detective Holt was contacted. He obtained a warrant. The storage unit contained, among other things, Raymond Voss's bowling bag. Inside the bowling bag were 3 items: a prepaid phone that matched the technical specifications of the second burner phone identified in the stadium cell tower records, a manila envelope containing documentation of the methodology errors in Nola Crane's 2004 forensic accounting analysis, and a handwritten note in Raymond's identifiable handwriting that said, in its entirety, "She took 8 years from me. I took back 2. The note was dated. It was dated September 13th, 2011, one day before the stadium photograph was taken. Raymond Voss had rented that storage unit himself. He had planned to be at that stadium. He had obtained a burner phone. And he had, for reasons the note strongly implied but did not fully explain, been engaged in some kind of sustained act of documentation or retribution against Nola Crane that had occupied 2 years of his life. But what had happened to him after September 14th? The storage unit was empty of Raymond. The burner phone was there. The bowling bag was there. Raymond was not. Thread 4. The aerial footage from the stadium's own security system. Harwick Stadium's internal security camera network covered the concourse, the entry gates, the concession areas, and the general bleacher sections from elevated angles. When Holt had originally reviewed this footage in October 2011, he'd been looking for Raymond Voss and had found nothing conclusive. The cameras covered so wide a field, and the crowds were dense enough that picking out a specific individual required knowing roughly where to look. In February 2012, Holt went back to the footage with new information. He knew from the photograph's timestamp and the cell tower records that the 2 burner phones had been active in a specific section of the bleachers from approximately 2:15 p.m. to 3:49 p.m. He knew from the photograph that Raymond and the woman he believed was Nola had been standing in that section. He reviewed the security camera coverage for that section during that time window with fresh eyes. He found them at 2:22 p.m. on the stadium's Section C concourse camera. Two people walking together, not speaking, maintaining a physical distance that suggested they were together by arrangement rather than accident. The navy blazer was clear. The woman's profile was partially visible, enough for Holt to be confident it was consistent with the person in the photograph. At 3:51 p.m., the camera captured Raymond and the same woman leaving the Section C concourse separately. Raymond walked toward the east exit. The woman walked toward the north exit. They did not look at each other as they separated. The whole thing was as choreographed as the rest of it. At 3:53 p.m., the camera captured Raymond Voss passing through the east exit turnstile. He was alone. He walked through the exit and out of frame. That was the last documented sighting of Raymond Voss, ever. The stadium footage was the pre-intro footage paid off. It placed both subjects at the scene, confirmed they had been there together, and documented the moment Raymond walked out of frame and did not come back into any camera anywhere ever again. Holt went back to Nola Crane in March 2012 with everything he had: the fraudulent passport stamp analysis, the ring comparison, the storage unit contents, the stadium security footage. He presented the full picture formally through Interpol channels. Nola was interviewed again, this time in person at a formal interview facility in Lisbon. She had a new attorney. She remained pleasant. She looked at every piece of evidence Holt presented and said, consistently and without apparent stress, that she had nothing to add to what she had previously said. On the passport, she expressed surprise at the analysis findings and said she trusted her own passport was genuine. On the ring, she said it was a common style and she had not worn that particular ring since 2010. On the stadium security footage, she said the image quality was insufficient to identify her with certainty. On the storage unit, and Raymond's note, she said she had no knowledge of Raymond Voss's private activities or writings. She smiled throughout. She thanked the investigators for their thoroughness. She said she hoped Raymond Voss would be found safe. Raymond Voss was never found. The case produced no arrest. No charges were ever filed against anyone in connection with Raymond's disappearance, because the evidence, while compelling in aggregate, fell short of the standard required for prosecution across an international jurisdictional boundary with a subject who had sophisticated legal representation and an impressive capacity for calm. Detective Bram Haller, one of the officers who had examined Nola's original passport and had been among the first investigators to flag the stamp anomaly, retired from the Stonebridge PD in February 2012, 4 months after his involvement in the case. He moved to a coastal property in Maine, a small town in Lincoln County that was too small to appear on most standard road maps. He has not spoken about the case publicly. The case was formally closed in April 2013 due to insufficient evidence of a prosecutable crime. Dale Whitmore still has the printed photograph. He keeps it in a filing cabinet in his home office. He does not display it. He says he looks at it occasionally, trying to figure out what to see in it. He says the woman's expression is what gets to him. Not threatening, not cold, just absolutely focused on a man who is trying not to be seen. He still cannot explain how a photograph he deleted from his camera on the evening of September 14th was in his mailbox on October 1st, printed and addressed and sticky noted. He says he tries not to think about the logistics of that too much. He says it's better not to. The formal charges that should have been filed in this case, had sufficient evidence been secured for prosecution, would have included false reporting of a death, obstruction of justice through fraudulent documentation, forgery of official travel documents, unauthorized tampering with a crime scene through the substitution of human remains at a registered burial site, and potentially conspiracy to commit fraud through the organized staging of a death. The severity of potential charges would have placed any convicted defendant in the range of 12 to 25 years under Connecticut and federal sentencing guidelines, with the document forgery charges carrying additional federal weight. No charges were ever filed. The case remains technically open in the Connecticut Cold Case Database. Petra Voss continued living in the house on the east side of Stonebridge for 2 years after the case closure. She relocated to Portland in 2015, closer to Raymond's sister, who she had, over the years of the investigation, become close to in the particular way that people become close when they are jointly waiting for news that doesn't come. Petra has given no media interviews. She made a single statement through a victim's advocate in 2014, which said only that she hoped Raymond was safe wherever he was, and that she hoped someday someone would tell her the truth.